Great. So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the February public lecture. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. This lecture is due to last an hour with a Q&A session at the end of the talk. If you would like to submit a question, you can do so via the Q&A function on the Zoom toolbar, and we will read these questions out for you. Just a reminder that all attendees must adhere to the Society's Events Code of Conduct. I've shared a link. I will share a link with you in the Zoom chat. So if you'd like to familiarise yourself, the link to the code will be there. This evening's talk is titled "Natural Justice: How Nature Delivers to the Criminal Justice System," and will be given by Professor Dame Lorna Dawson. Professor Dame Lorna Dawson is head of the Centre for Forensic Soil Science at the James Hutton Institute and a leading international expert in forensic geoscience. A chartered scientist with more than 150 publications, she has assisted in over 200 criminal and civil cases as a registered expert within the UK National Crime Agency. Lorna regularly appears as an expert witness in high-profile trials and public inquiries, and Lorna also holds multiple fellowships and key roles in national and international forensic science organisations, and her contributions have been recognised with honours including a Dame of the British Empire in 2026 and a CBE in 2018. Over to you, Lorna.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you everyone for coming along. It's such a terrible night. It's -3 up here in Aberdeen, and I'm sorry I couldn't come down in person, but I just gave evidence in a criminal trial here in Scotland. So without further ado, thank you very much to the Geological Society of London for inviting me along to give you one of the lectures in their series CSI Geoscience. And the talk is entitled Soil Science, Assisting in the Criminal Investigations, and I'm representing the Geological Society and the Forensic Geoscience Group, and also the Initiative Forensic Geology and Robert Gordon University James Hutton Institute. What I'm going to talk about is a little bit of introduction about the disciplines that deliver to the forensic and the criminal justice system, that context of these subjects, mainly in application to search, assisting investigators in search, but also the evaluation and the trace evidence comparison. Now, all of these can be used in murders, serious and organised crime investigations, rape, stolen artefacts, fake goods, wildlife crime, metal theft, you name it, it can be used to assist the working out the question where something had come from. And in the United Kingdom, we're very, very fortunate in that we've got really good databases, geological underpinning, surface superficial deposits, and also the soil itself, that very surface skin that reflects the surface that people come into contact with. But we weren't first by any means. It was the Romans that first used soil by looking at the hooves of their enemies' horses. And from examining that and the soil and the vegetation that was embedded in the hooves, they could work out from intelligence, by knowing the different landscapes, where their enemies were coming from. And then, of course, in Central Europe, Christian Elberg, he showed that the practice of substitution could be established by looking at soil. It was sandy material that had been substituted for silver coins that had been in these barrels. And what he also did was he went along the different stations along that Prussian railroad and compared the sand that was at those locations. And when he did that, he could exclude all of the stations apart from one. And indeed, the police went to that place and found the people who were substituting the silver coins with sand. And that was published in Scientific American in 1856. And then it was Hans Gross around 1850s, turned 1915, who was actually a criminal psychiatrist. And what he did was he combined soil petrology with topography. And he called dirt on shoes can often tell us more about where the wearer of those shoes had last been than toilsome inquiries. Well, I think it complements inquiries and can add to the questions such as what happened, not on its own, but it's often in combination. But he was one of the first to talk about the use of soil, but he called it dirt. And then Gail Pop, 1904 and then 1908. And I'll show you at the start of a little video here, and I'll then move forward to the part where he describes the stratigraphy of the soil and how that can establish not just contact with one location, but several locations. And indeed, those several locations is so important that he established that stratigraphy. So I'm going to fast forward now to the point where the BBC presenter, you can see in this principle that recreated that scenario over 100 years ago, how he was very much ahead of his time. But we still do that today by taking individual layers away. We can work out just the several locations and how that fits in with the scenario of when someone stood and contacted the surface and relates to perhaps the scene of a crime, or indeed it might relate to an alibi location. So it's important to consider the alternatives of where material may have come from. But of course, you in London and in Edinburgh up here in Scotland, the famous Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the crime writer who created Sherlock Holmes and Watson. And in his books, there are 4 of them in which he mentions forensic geoscience. And in The Sign of 4, Holmes established which part of London, Wigmore Street, by the mud being identical to that on the broken pavement outside that particular post office. But he not only discussed the use of a whole range of different forensic sciences, including geology and soil, but in 1906 and 1912, he actually acted in a court of law where he, as a result of his evidence, George Edley and Oscar Slater were acquitted. So quite an incredible man, Arthur Conan Doyle. But Edwin Locard in 1910 was the person who came up with the phrase, every contact leaves a trace. He said that whenever 2 objects come into contact, there is always a transfer of material. The methods of detection may not be sensitive enough to demonstrate this, or the decay rate may be so rapid that all evidence of transfer has vanished after a given time. Nonetheless, the transfer has taken place. Now, in that intervening time, methods have developed such they are much more sensitive and can work with tiny, tiny amounts of trace material so that the perpetrator doesn't even know that they have transferred that material onto them, their person or an object. He described soil as dust or dirt, and it's included in the physical evidence, the trace evidence that can be taken from a scene or out of a scene onto a person's shoes or clothing or even an object. But all forensic science is about answering questions, and the questions that are often asked was who was involved. And it's largely the anthropologists or the forensic biologists who answer that question. And all contributes to the what happened. And how did it happen? Again, every piece of forensic science comes together to build up a picture of how it happened. The ultimate difficult question is when did it happen? But increasing taphonomic expertise and insect information can work out that time window, but there's no substitute. And it's often digital evidence or records of phone records or a credit card use that gives the time window. And why it happened? Well, why did it happen? That's the ultimate question. But where geology and geoscience can help is to get to the where did it happen question, or to exclude where did it not happen. But all of this is very much teamwork from the developing research science. So all the time new experiments are being run and tested, but they've got to be fully peer reviewed and published and first tested in court before they're permitted to be used within the field of forensic science. But working with the police investigators right through to being presented in court. And geoscience or soil science is a scientific study of geological material as a natural resource. And the forensic word means pertaining to the law. And there's many other disciplines which are not core, such as pathology, entomology, taphonomy, geography, anthropology, geophysics, botany, ecology, palynology, pedology, archaeology, geology. All of those ologists contribute depending on the particular crime. So it could be several experts are asked to come and help on an investigation, and it won't always be the same disciplines that are invited to the team. But where geological trace evidence comes into play within criminal investigations, by helping in search for missing victims or buried items, identifying the location of potential crime scenes, testing if there is a link and association between, let's say, footwear, clothing, or vehicles and a crime scene, or potentially alternatively to an alibi location, or identifying geological items such as a rock that may be used during an offence. And also to identify stolen or fake goods, identifying, let's say, there's been an adulteration to a product. Well, forensic geoscience can contribute there. Of course, soil covers our whole earth. It covers most of our terrestrial surface. And people have to get from A to B by walking, cycling, using a vehicle, and customarily there is contact. And often it's unconsolidated, particularly when it's wet, if there's clay, if there's organic matter, then it tends to more readily transfer. And it persists. It can persist for weeks, if not months, depending on if it's protected and how much has transferred and the force that's occurred during that transfer. Vehicles and tools are often submitted as exhibits for us to look at. From the wheel arches, again, it's the layers that we'd have to consider that might reflect various contact locations. And in the old days, they used to hoover up the material that was found, let's say, in a footwell mat. But now we would ask that the investigators submit the whole footwell mat intact and submit the whole pedal being removed from the vehicle, because it's trying to get that single source question sample, that unknown sample. Where has it come from? But if we mix it all up, we're never going to get comparability between that unknown sample with the known sample that we're trying to see. Is there a link? And also samples in the boot. We would seize that whole spade because there could be multiple samples that could reflect multiple contact points at different horizons in the soil. Footwear is one of the most readily submitted types of exhibit. And we can look at the layers of the soil that are on these boots or shoes, and even feet. We can recover the fragments of soil or vegetation from them. And particularly if you get soil and vegetation and partial marks left behind by that type of shoe, that combination of evidence increases the evidential strength of it being that item that created or had made contact at that place. That, coupled with the wearer DNA, because who was wearing that item of footwear, can be very powerful indeed. And increasingly, we can work with small amounts of material. And indeed, the amount under these fingernails is enough for us to carry out a comparative analysis. And the bottom image is there. It's a filter from a washing machine. And that was recovered by the police in this investigation. And what we did was we ran the reference material, the control samples from the scene through the same cycle as these jeans, which had been worn by the accused. And when we did that and compared it, it had exactly the same mineral profile. And when he was faced with that evidence, he admitted that he'd carried out the crime. But we can also use geological information, soil information to help indicate that there's multiple burials. The top image there is where there are two bodies that have been buried and wrapped in black plastic. And what we could identify that in the layers of the plastic was another soil, a soil that had not come from that particular location, but we identified where it had come from up in Scotland. And again, the vegetation can tell us that it's recently been disturbed, or the middle image shows that there's been an object, there's been a body decomposed there, and the vegetation has been so radically changed. It doesn't always change in that way. It can enhance it, it can decrease it. And again, that needs a forensic botanist to opine on that type of situation. And the image on the right was one where we looked at the growth of plants through a skeleton to help the police work out the window of when that person had likely been laid there, and then they could identify who'd gone missing at that time window. But this is James Hutton, and I work from the Centre of Forensic Soil Science at the James Hutton Institute, where James Hutton, who we're named after, said that soil was a living bridge between rock and life. He was a forensic geologist, a forensic agricultural scientist, and in that context, he stated that we are to examine the construction of the present earth in order to understand the natural operations of time past. Now, when we look at soil or geological material in a forensic context, we're just narrowing that time window down to weeks or months or years. He was looking at decades, centuries, when he was doing his interpretation. But equally well, we can use that same principle, that soils and rocks hold secrets that we can unravel with the solid science behind it. And soil can be an ideal trace evidence as it is variable. It varies hugely from very, very close distances. And it is a high probability of transferring and persisting. It's not often seen. It's splashes that people don't realise have been transferred. They can be collected, separated and analysed. And the smallest traces can now be characterised with reliable and accredited methods. And we now have computerised databases that we can put into context any similarities that we find between a questioned sample and a known sample. And it's a mixture. It is got the inorganic part, the minerals, the elements that are largely derived from that geology, the parent material. But there's also man-made introduced materials that we can also look for. So other pollutants, other contaminants, we can also identify and quantify them. And then there's the organic component, largely plant-derived from the decomposing plant material that fall at a particular location, they decompose, and the persistent parts, the biomolecules of those plant material is left behind like a fingerprint, which we can identify what type of habitat that has come from. And then the third component, that is the biological part, the bacteria, the fungi, the archaea, the mites, the nematodes, all of these represent different types of habitat, and that can really help us. And in the future, with the databases we're now building up with environmental DNA and specific marker DNA, we'll be able to use that to better indicate the question of when a body first was decomposing in an area. But to work within the criminal justice system, we should follow guidelines. We should follow principles that have been developed within our discipline. And for example, a book that was published through the Geological Society, A Guide to Forensic Geology, that lays out the different principles from the context of where geology can be used, right through to how we would work at a crime scene, to how we would consider the analytical methods to use, to ultimately how we would present it in court. And also from a European perspective, guidelines from the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes, that the best practice manual for soil trace comparison is available on the website. And this is a very good lab practice for guidelines of how to carry out the examination and analysis. And here, for example, it's broken down into various stages. The first stage being the investigation and examination of case samples before anything is even done. So is there enough soil on the item? Is it going to be suitable? Will it be consistent to examine it and analyse it, prepare it, and then analyse a portion, and ideally leave a portion behind for defence or prosecution to also analyse, and then compare the results, decide if it's suitable for court, write the report, evaluate the data, and if required, present it in court. But there's a whole range of potential methods that one could use, depending on if it's an organic material or if it's largely inorganic, such as in a lower near the parent material in a sea horizon. And in there, for a question of where it came from, then X-ray diffraction could quantify the minerals that are in that rock, which then relates back to the bedrock and the likely location it's come from. But if we're talking about the organic matter and the type of habitat it's come from, gas chromatography, palynology, FTIR, or even microbial DNA profiles. And if it's got a tiny amount, then SEM, EDX could be the appropriate method to consider. But it's not only what the soil tells us in terms of its characterization of minerals and organics and living parts, but it's also what can be hidden in the soil. So here we've got some examples from casework where a tiny little bit of plastic, and that was compared with material in the soil at the scene, and this was on an item of footwear, and it was quite a distinctive type of plastic from Poland, and it was from a bottle which had degraded in that environment, and it linked very closely, quite distinctive to having come from the same place. Here we've got a human hair, and that's taken as a sub-exhibit and given to the biologist to then get DNA or compare the hair with a database. And here we've got that of a dog, and in this case, it was given to the veterinarian who compared that DNA of the dog, and it was that of the pet of the lady whose house had been broken into, and it didn't go out of the house, and there was no other reason for it to be on the accused footwear. So this was a very strong piece of evidence that led him to admit breaking into her house. But it can be diatoms, it can also be little bits of sand. Here we've got fibres from a carpet, and the bottom image here is a piece of skin that linked. Then the biologist extracted the DNA and could identify who the individual that had been there by the skin flakes that were there. So helping with search, it can be a long, laborious process, but for that, we can use geology, we can use soil, we can use vegetation, combining it as layers so that we're building up the layers, so narrowing down where that material could have come from. We can produce maps, or we can produce digital geographic and information systems. If it's on a scale of national or regional around a town, then we can carry out that using the 1 to 250,000 soils map, or if it's local, 1 to 25,000. And now in England and Wales, the soils data is now going to also be made freely available. So that will be very powerful indeed. And I will take you to the second part of this BBC4 production.
That muddy evidence came from. At the Hutton Institute Labs in Aberdeen, one of my boots is having its mud removed for analysis.
We can tell specifics about what those species are.
Professor Lorna Dawson and her team have instruments and techniques at their disposal which Pop could only have dreamt of. After 2 days of tests, Lorna takes her new data to her colleague David Miller.
So we use the national mapping of resources of Scotland.
David has maps of Scotland which contain information about minerals, plant distribution and the soil itself.
Interrogate and ask some
But have they learnt enough to tell me where the mud on my boots came from? It's a process of elimination.
Lorna, can you give me some idea of what we're going to be looking for first? What we
Well,
cannot be looking in?
What we knew from the gas chromatography.
The first result arose from gas chromatography, which analyses traces of organic matter and chemicals. It revealed the absence in our sample of this pink line of hydrocarbon pollution caused by cars. We didn't film in a town or city.
So we exclude the urban areas of Scotland.
Okay, so that's all the black areas now and not part of the search?
Yes, exactly. Next.
Using techniques that Pop would have been very comfortable with, Lorna studied the soil itself and the botanical traces it contains under a microscope.
You can see that there's a fibrous texture to that soil. It's got very small granular structure. It's not a single grain as you would find generally in an arable soil. It's not got the peat fibres that you would expect in a peatland.
So Lorna concluded that we didn't film in peatlands and uplands, these purple sections. And she excludes all of Scotland's arable land in light green from the central belt to the northeast. But Lorna did find fragments of beech leaves. Gas chromatography confirmed there were no chemicals connected with pines and conifers. It's deciduous forest they're looking for. Scotland's pine forests, in dark green, are eliminated. We're really narrowing down now to really what looks like a tiny amount left of Scotland of where this could have been, this walk.
Well, we hope it is.
So you were telling me something about the underlying geology.
Lorna's team has two powerful resources for geological analysis. X-ray crystallography identifies the minerals found on my boot by their crystal structure. And the National Soil Archive, soils from all over Scotland, has been used to make a database for comparison with crime scene samples. In our case, the results point to an area of volcanic soils that surrounds Glasgow.
So the area we're zooming in is to the north and the west of Glasgow. Here.
Now they're looking not at where I wasn't, but at where I was.
Then what we're interested in are the areas...
Lorna and David's software highlights areas in yellow where the right kind of volcanic soil can be found with deciduous trees.
Look just a little bit to the north of Glasgow. There's quite a big area here which fits the characteristics. So
They soon home in on a place that looks very familiar.
it's got the right soil characteristics and
I think I'm about to be astonished.
That could be an area that you picked up the soil, and that would certainly be an area that we would prioritise to the police to search.
And where is this area?
this is Mugdock Castle at Mugdock Country Park just north of Glasgow that we're looking at just now, and Mugdock Loch.
I'm completely blown away. It's absolutely amazing. It's exactly where we were.
Was that where you were?
Exactly where we were. So out of 78,000 square kilometres to what would this area be?
This area will be a few hundred square metres.
Amazing.
Can
It's
you
amazing.
point where you walked?
Well, we were right by the castle
Gosh.
and we went down into the forest. There was a valley.
So that showed the principle and in practice, and there was a few sleepless nights that we had before the visit of BBC to film that. But we got very close to where she was. And basically it was excluding where it had not come from by putting those layers to including the colour, pH, carbon content, mineralogy, taking to that area and then prioritising with distance from a road, potential areas for search. But then the BBC One show came and did the same, and we don't have time to show it tonight, but this is available on YouTube. But the One show, we did it and we also found the location using that principle of layering, including the information that we can give from geology, soil, vegetation, along with intelligence that the police have, such as last known position, maximum likely distance travelled in the sphere of activity. And in there we got Dalmeny Estate, and again we got to with 700 metres of where they'd walked in the One show. But depending on the question, it's the issue of scale. So if we're looking at a landscape scale question, we would be looking at the geology. Whereas if we're looking at the specific locus-derived question, metres apart, we would then go to the wax marker analysis, the organics, because they can differentiate between a metre apart, whereas the mineralogy can differentiate kilometre square apart. So it all depends on the case question. Now, I'm not going to go into this, but I'll show you very briefly. This was done with Police Scotland, and it was looking at geophysics. This is not about geophysics, but you'll be getting lectures later on in this series about that topic. But it's important once you've found a site, what you then do with the geophysics.
Folks, we're gathered here to play out this exercise. The circumstances of the exercise are that it's a murder investigation. It's happened, the murders occurred about 4 days ago elsewhere in Glasgow, and our inquiries have kind of brought us here today. I am Detective Chief Inspector Brian Gerris of Police Scotland. The inquiries we've carried out to date centre around a suspect for the murder, a search of his home address and a search of his vehicle. From his home address we have recovered a pair of boots which have been analysed by some of our scientists and external experts, and from his vehicle we've recovered a spade.
Now I'm going to zoom on to near the end where
You'll disturb the ground and disturb the evidence that is there below.
from all the geophysics has been carried out to identify where there'd be anomalies.
It's so important, that chain of custody, and that's why you flag things, you record things, and then you do the destructive recovery. So it's non-destructive to get all the information together, flagging the areas that look like they're interesting because they've shown up anomalies and they look like they fit the size, shape and materials of what you're looking for.
The aim of any police investigation is to fully establish the circumstances, so recovering the items that we believe linked to the crime are absolutely key to getting potentially a conviction further down the line, and the integrity of the work has to be of the highest standard to ensure that we recover these items without any cross-contamination or any other issues that may affect it in the court setting further down the line.
At the end of the geoforensic search strategy, what we provide is a high assurance for the presence of a buried target. This could be a murder victim, a grave, it could be an item related to counter-terrorism or serious and organised crime.
As crime scene managers, I hope this has given you a flavour of what it's like for you to be in charge of an outdoor scene, and how through cooperation and collaboration that Police Scotland, along with the experts through the National Crime Agency, whether that's geophysicists, geologists, soil scientists, ecologists, botanists, whatever, bringing together the expertise and working together.
So technology is always advancing and it will always be useful and will bring something to every search. It is not the answer because personnel and our collective decisions are just as important.
Teamwork and collaboration, both within and out with the organisation, are key to these type of investigations. And over the years, we've built up some real strong relationships with our soil scientists and geophysicists, which again have helped us in the past and will hopefully help us in this exercise today. And the sharing of that learning will hopefully benefit to investigators and crime scene managers across the organisation.
So, moving on to the scenario, we've found the scene, the geophysics have identified what's important. A body's been found down a slope, been found by a dog walker, as is often the case because of volatiles. It's been cordoned off. A common approach path has been agreed upon where there's no one likely come before. Full PPE is put on, and areas identified that might be of interest, and markers identified, photographs taken, and evidence recovered. Here we've got blood on a stone, fingernails, footwear, clothing, any orifices, hair, and the pathologist works out likely cause of death, and the body is removed for pathology examination in the path lab. And protection of trace evidence, recovery of that trace evidence. And at that stage, the forensic geoscientist decides what should be done, attend, prepare the maps, the GIS, site characteristics, consider the type of soil, the depth of time, consider the report then on sampling and assess the role of soil. Make sure the common approach path being designated, consider did they walk, were they travel, did they drive to the scene, were they alive at the time. Soil sampling can be important both in rural and urban scenes. If there's no indication where a car or a person's entered or exited, then representative sampling is carried out. If the soil's wet at the time, the depth of sampling has to reflect that it'll probably go in deeper. And if you don't know the entry or exit routes, then sampling has to be carried out at all these potential contact routes. And in the case of a burial situation, many samples have to be taken, again to represent where there may be contact with spades or tools, or indeed the foot of the grave is important because somebody may have stood there too. And with contact surfaces, where you've got features such as a tyre mark and a footwear mark, you can work out who stood where, or was the car there first before the people got out of the vehicle. And photography is important, taking context the shot and also a close-up shot to look at where that sample's been collected from. Sterile spatula, scale, marker, and put into a pot and an evidence bag, sealed and signed, and for chain of custody is absolutely important. Before the samples are then submitted to the laboratory for consideration and analysis, whether that's a large exhibit, a smaller, or it's got particular requirements, the integrity is important. Is it sealed? Is it dated? Is it signed? Is it too large to transport? Do you have to go to examine the vehicle? All those questions have to be considered. Discuss it with the SIO, decide on a sampling strategy, recover it, single source samples, and take photographs and make records of everything that's done and store them and record the considerations. When you're recovering the question samples, for example, from clothing, there'll be multiple samples taken because that might reflect multiple contact locations, and consider whether it should be scanning electron microscopy if there's only a tiny bit, or if another method could be used, and map those positions because that could indicate the position of where the contact was made. What is that material like? Are there multiple sources that have come onto that footwear? Remember the stratigraphy of Gale Pop, that's important, multiple samples. Vehicle exteriors, has the soil been wet at the time? Has it splashed? Again, several samples would need to be taken to reflect often many contact points. And underneath the car, suspension arms, all of those are important to link to location. Interior of cars, here we've got a foot pedal, that's got a discrete, it could be transferred secondary from the footwear, that's all got to be considered. Or also smearing, where clothing may have brushed upon a part of the interior. Again, all that's got to be photographed, recorded. And here we've got 4 examples of not all soils are eco that are submitted. It could be largely the mineral matter, organic, or it could be the soil water, which could give you diatoms, or the air that could give you the volatiles. But whatever it is, we take individual aggregates, individual PEDs, which are more likely to get the best comparison with the seen sample. So once you've decided on the type of analysis, you've described it, carry out the analysis, report, give it to the police, decide is it a report for evaluating that intelligence, or is it a report for court? Is it a witness statement? All those things have to be assessed. To do that, the data has to be interpreted. And in this case of the girl found on the slope, a suspect's been found, and the footwear's been examined, it's been analysed, and we use the soil data in Scotland. We select the type of soil using the filters to narrow down where it might have come from, semi-natural vegetation, and it's got a coniferous woodland with a pH of 3.85. So that very quickly narrows down the areas, and then of a carbon content of between 25 and 30. And that narrows down. We know the areas in Edinburgh. The car was seen on ANPR, so that we go to within a 30-minute drive, and then a boundary of 500 metres from that roadway to do the search. And we can overlay those layers on that. We know it was a coniferous woodland, and we search, and this is the area that has all those attributes based on the satellite imagery and all the database values of geology, soil, land cover. And so we get to there, we end up with a 2 kilometre square area to then say, we must look at that area to work out where the soil that was on the shoe of the suspect had come from. We go to that site, we identify the areas, and that gives us a potential murder site, extra to where the body was found. The body had been rolled down that bank. Remember the rock with the blood? That blood was the victim's blood. Her head got knocked there. She'd been dead before she'd been rolled down there. On her shoes, there was no vegetation from the locus from where she was found, but there was material on her fingernails. And when that was compared, the material on her fingernails was from that coniferous woodland, the woodland that the GIS identified where it had come from. The soil on the suspect's shoe had come from the bank where she'd rolled her down. And this is Locard's exchange principle coming back that I mentioned at the beginning. And any action of an individual, an obvious violent action constituting a crime, cannot occur without leaving a trace. So what we've got here is the perpetrator who's got soil on the front of his shoe that links to that bank at that scene where the body was found. We've also got soil on the rear, which has the coniferous needles and the same soil from that coniferous woodland. The victim's shoe has that conifer, her nails has that conifer, the top of the shoe has the place that she'd rolled down. So it links together those sites. So it helps the police reconstruct what happened. It had not come from his home address at the alibi site, but he had killed her at the murder site and taken her body and rolled it down to where she was found. So now very briefly, I picked 4 examples, and you can look these up later, but examples where soil has been central to the particular cases. His Majesty's Advocate versus Sinclair in 2014, the soil analysis showed that one of the victims, Helen Scott, had been in contact not only with soil where she was found murdered, but on the roadside barge, and that contradicted Angus Sinclair's alibi. Her Majesty's Advocate versus Willock in 2021, the murder of Emma Faulds, and that was helped find where her body was found, and it also linked him through soil on his boots to directly where her body was found. Regina versus Halliwell, Bristol Crown Court in 2016, it was soil on tools that linked him to being at the location where Rebecca Godden was found. And then more recently in 2024, Majesty's Advocate versus McKellar at Glasgow High Court, the soil and the vegetation identified where the people who had knocked Tony Parsons down had buried him, but it also was used as evidence to work out what had happened. and the fact that the body had been temporarily stored outside the farmhouse before his final burial, and both accused ultimately pled guilty. So it's in the two main areas that forensic geoscience can help, in the investigative questions, intelligence. So where did the soil come from? The question soil, we don't know where it's come from. We can answer that by looking at the geology maps, the soil maps, the vegetation maps, to exclude and exclude and exclude, and then include and identify where it might have come from. But the evidential, evaluative part of it is the probability that it's come from one location. Based on the information, the analytical information, is it more probable that it's come from the crime scene location rather than from the alibi location, or is it just as likely? We have to consider alternative propositions, using an appropriate combination of methods and comparing to case-relevant populations of soil, and remembering there is uncertainty, and remembering that the questions that we get would be at source level. So where did the soil come from? Or did the soil come from the crime scene? And perhaps sometimes at activity level of advising what likely happened, or along with DNA on the handle of a spade to comment on whether the activity was that that person had likely dug that particular grave and what horizon the spade had come into contact with, but never at offence level. That is the duty of the court. And to ever present in court, it must be peer-reviewed, it must be published, it must be accepted by its peers, and it must be communicated well. And in doing so, remember that in the United Kingdom, Scots law, and England and Wales, it is an adversarial system. So it's much tougher on the expert evidence than inquisitorial systems, much more difficult to get new evidence admitted, but geology and soil have been used effectively for the last 20 years. But it can still be challenged, that reliability, and particularly in America, this is a quote from Kenneth Cohen, who said he's been battered, flattered, bruised, embarrassed, bloodied, thanked, cajoled, etc. So, but he still survives as an expert witness. And in court, what we did with the Faculty of Advocates was we created with a crime author an hour-long scenario based on an old case with new evidence. And that was used by the Open University to help debate with multiple fake audiences, because in the United Kingdom, jurors cannot comment after a court case as to how the decisions were made. So this allowed the discussion about the not proven verdict in Scotland, and then now that has been stopped and it's only guilty or not guilty. And I'll show you just a very short part, but where you can see that it's helpful to use real life people that know how do we carry out within a court. Because many jurors, it's the first time they've ever been in a court.
Ladies and gentlemen, the charge against the accused Paul Anthony Darren is that on 19 November 2018 at 118 Dumbarton Square, Glasgow, he, Paul Anthony Darren, did assault Elizabeth Michelle Lang, now deceased, formerly residing there, and did tie a pulley cord around her neck and did strangle her with that pulley cord, and he did murder her.
Were you on duty on the 19th of November of last year?
I was.
Were you at the public counter within Glasgow West End Police Station?
Correct.
Did a man approach the public counter at about 3 o'clock in the morning?
That's right, yes.
Did you later learn that that man was a Paul Darren?
Yes.
This wasn't a man walking into your police station confessing to stealing a Mars bar, was it? On your evidence, this was a man walking into your police station and confessing to murder. And what Mr. Darren actually said was, "My wife is dead, don't think I killed her."
And the one thing that happened was that was shown to every modern studies class in the whole of Scotland, so that every pupil could experience what it's like, representation from different sides in a court of law. But this is done, as we've said, right through. It's all teamwork. It's from the society, such as the Geological Society, who allows people to come together and allows the promotion of this science across different ages. through the International Union of Geological Sciences, Faculty of Advocate, the Crown Office, Police Scotland, BBC, communicating the science, and ESRI, who have the databases to help develop the models to use the right GIS. And Robert Gordon University and the James Hutton Institute and the Scottish Government and EPSRC, who funded a lot of this research. None of this could be done without it. And I'm happy to answer questions now, or you can always email me later. But it's important that we've got everyone working under the ground, understanding our bedrock and understanding the very skin upon which our whole society survives. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lorna, for such a very interesting talk on an incredibly important topic. We have quite a few questions, as expected. So the first question is there an expected lifespan for soil analysis? Say for cold cases, could old boots, for example, still contain trace amounts?
A very good question, and indeed, yes, because geological material and a lot of soil material, particularly if you're looking at the inorganic part of that, will not change over time, provided it's been kept in a suitable environment and it's not been stored wet. Then we can still go back to that. In fact, there's been a few cases of unresolved murders where one case is the World's End murder, where we went back and the soil had been retained and protected. It had not been opened. And 40 years later, we were able to analyse that and still recover the organic fractions that told us it had come from two different habitats.
Great, thank you. Another question. For the collection of database, for the collection of the database, is there a standardised procedure that is used all around, or is this UK, Scotland, Wales specific?
So in Scotland, there is one database for the soils of Scotland, but that database collects many, many, many attributes of soil. And that has been collected over the years. It's been recovered soil in the 1970s, but it was also resampled in 2007. So we were able to compare things over time. And also that's from the James Hutton Institute, but in England and Wales, there's a database that's been collected at Cranfield University, and that's now being made available. And they'll all be at different resolutions, but most of the methods such as carbon, iron, aluminium, pH, have all been carried out using standardised methods. And that's the good thing, is that they can be compared because they're accredited methods that are used. At Northern Ireland, they've got the TELUS project, and they have got really, really fantastic high-resolution data in that database. So yeah, it varies, but in the United Kingdom, we're pretty lucky compared to the rest of the world.
Talking about the rest of the world, this next question on that subject. How advanced would you say is the use of forensic geoscience worldwide? I am wondering how many countries actively use it in investigations.
Well, that again is a very good question, and I'm part of the International Union of Geological Sciences initiative on forensic geology, and that's the international body that shares this knowledge across the world. So that probably in the United Kingdom, we're probably one of the big centres, and that's much to the thanks of the Geological Society of London, because we've got such a good grounding, if I may use that word, in using geological information to understand what's happening, not only in engineering, but also in crime and food quality standard, all of these areas. And what we're doing is we're going out with this body of scientists from Australia, from Italy, from Russia, from all over the world. We come together and we go to other countries such as Brazil, where we've been working to help find the missing people. We've been using it to help track down fake gold. So these same principles are used all across the world, and we're trying to expand that knowledge and transfer it to countries where they maybe haven't got the same advantages that we've got in the development of the innovation and technology. So yeah, it's a fantastic organisation, and it allows that transfer of knowledge and communication of knowledge. In fact, in 2 years' time, the Geological Societies is having a meeting in Canada, and all the countries from all over the world will come there, and we'll be running a session to transfer the knowledge.
Great, thank you. Dee has asked, can Lorna tell us how she got into this wonderful speciality?
Well, strangely enough, it was about 22, 23 years ago. It was then the Grampian Police. It's now the whole Police Scotland, all the police forces have merged in Scotland. But at that time, a police officer had come along to the front door and said, "You've got a database here on soils. Could you tell me where the soil on my spade had come from?" So I said, "Well, we'll have a go." So we did, and we ran it through a whole load of tests. And luckily, there was a lot of soil on that spade. So we could run pH, we could run carbon, we could run nitrogen, we could run iron, aluminium. We could then compare that analytical data with our database, which held over 12,000 records. And we narrowed it down to a particular Counterswell series soil near to Aberdeen. And we saw fragments of vegetation in the sample, which was mixed birch beech woodland. So I went to the police officer to this location. I said, "Yeah, I think it's here." And they took the dogs there. And within 10 minutes, the dogs identified where the buried drugs had been in that forest. So at that point, we said, right, we've got to get funding. We applied to EPSRC and we got international funding to test it across the whole of the UK and develop the appropriate methods that could be used. And as you say, the rest is history. So it came from a direct need, you could say, to get that to the standard that it could be acceptable in a court of law.
Great, thank you. If a body was initially buried, then exhumed and reburied elsewhere, does that disturbance in soil mixing make the original soil profile more difficult to identify or interpret?
That's an interesting question. I'd wonder who's asked that one. That's quite a complicated one. But yes, that has happened. And I don't know if you remember the image that I showed where there were two bodies wrapped in black plastic. Well, we were able to take the soil that was in the layers of black plastic from one of the victims, analyze that soil, and compare that with all the soils that we had across the UK and work out where that body had been before it had come and been then transferred into that secondary grave. Yes, you can tell, you can see physical differences such as colour and texture. And then you follow that with the analytical measures that you can then compare with the database. So yes, you can see differences. There may be only subtle, and that's why the expert eye, the forensic scientist, can look at these differences and know where to look to see what type of soil it's come from. So particularly if you get fragments of vegetation, or if there's more organic material than you would expect in that soil horizon. So you can, and indeed there's been several cases where that has helped work out where the primary murder site was. And we've used it in exhumation. So for example, I did a piece of work with Reuters where we looked at a site in Syria based on remote sensing data and the colour of the soil, and from that we identified a site of mass grave movement. So it can be used in humanitarian cases as well.
Great, thank you. If there are any geography or geology students that are interested in forensic geoscience, are there any tips or good resources for learning about it?
Well, speak to the Geological Society, go and visit Burlington House and the wonderful library that is there. And also there'll be the books that I've mentioned, that book, Guide to Forensic Geology. Have a look at that. It's actually at a reduced price at the moment, £20 or something like that from the Society. That's a very good book. It is, I think, relatively easy to read. There's also the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes. Have a look at that. Have a look at the International Union of Geological Sciences website. It's now run by a student charter in Brazil, because Brazil are really passionate about forensic geology, and they themselves, as students, have developed a website where they put on resources. So if you're a geography or geology student, have a look at those and consider coming along to some of the conferences that are run, because sometimes we have student sessions, or if you're thinking of doing a master's or a PhD, then we also very much welcome student presentations at those meetings.
Thank you. One final question. If you live in an area with a limited database, is there any way the general public can assist with widening the database?
Oh, citizen science. Well, that would be wonderful. It'd be wonderful if we could get funding to get that specific to areas that doesn't have the resolution of data that you need. But if you don't actually have it, then individuals can help, because, for example, farmers that manage their land probably know each individual field better than any mapping has done. So you do talk to individual people that know their own countryside and know where there are wetter patches. So that's the important thing about geoscience, is that you speak to the people that live in that environment. But yeah, I think we need to think about, maybe with the Geological Society, would there be a way that we could include enthusiastic students at school or at university to gather more evidence, more information, even about colour? That could be useful. And that can be done with very little equipment, just the naked eye and a little colour chart.
Thank you so much for answering those questions. So if you enjoyed the talk this evening, next week we'll be running free online webinars focused on forensic geoscience, notably soil analysis, the history, and geomorphology. They are aimed at Key Stage 3, however, everyone is welcome to join, and you can find all the details in the link shared in the chat. A recording of the talk this evening will be available on YouTube later this week, and I'll also email it around to those who registered for the event this evening. And just to let you know, our next public lecture, Exploring the Extraterrestrial from Meteors to Micrometeorites with Dr. Stephen Grimes, will take place on the 31st of March. This lecture will be delivered both in person at the Geological Society in London and online via Zoom. So lastly, thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and a massive thank you to Lorna for giving such a brilliant talk.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.